They tell you a man overboard is the worst thing in the Bering Sea. They're wrong. 3 days ago, we lost a man inside a room locked from the inside. The only thing that got in or out was a sound, a low, soft hum. The ocean is vast, but it's not empty, and it's learning our names. My name is Liam Keller, and this is my 3rd season hauling king crab on the Boreas. If you're receiving this transmission, it means the encrypted data burst I set up on a timer has worked. It means I didn't make it back. But the world needs to know what happens out here, in the vast, unforgiving emptiness. You need to understand that the charts are incomplete. The sea has secrets older than humanity, and we just woke one of them up. Life in the Bering Sea is a battle of attrition. You don't fight the cold, you endure it. It's a living presence, a parasite that latches onto the ship and never lets go. It worms its way through triple-layered gear, paints the steel deck in treacherous glassy sheens, and turns a careless breath into a cloud of razor-sharp crystals. The sea is a churning mass of liquid steel, perpetually angry, and the sky is a lid of bruised purple and grey that presses down on you, suffocating the spirit. Our entire universe is the 120-foot length of the Boreas, a vessel that feels less like a machine and more like an ancient, tired beast. Every groan of its hull, every shudder as a wave crashes over the bow, sounds like a complaint against the endless abuse. The air is a thick soup, a permanent blend of diesel fumes, the cloying stench of bait, and the sharp, clean smell of salt and money. There are 6 of us, a fragile ecosystem of sleep-deprived men, and at the center of this world, on the bridge, stands Captain Corbin. He's a man who seems to have been carved from the same gnarled, salt-bleached wood as the docks in Dutch Harbor. His face is a roadmap of gales and hardships, and his eyes are the color of a frozen sea, holding a depth that seems to reflect a lifetime of staring into the abyss. He speaks little, but when he does, his words carry the weight of scripture. His authority isn't earned, it's an elemental fact of life on the Boreas, and his laws, his infamous rules, are the foundation of our survival. Every greenhorn learns the rules. They're not written down anywhere. You learn them through the sharp glance of a veteran, the sudden, tense silence on deck, or a clipped, one-sentence command from Corbin himself. They aren't superstitions. They're something more. They are protocols for navigating a world that doesn't always adhere to the laws of physics we take for granted back on shore. Rule number 1, never whistle on deck. This was the first one I learned. During a grueling 20-hour shift my first season, I started whistling a mindless tune, a ghost of a song to keep my frozen hands moving. Gunner, a bear of a man with hands like deck cleats, didn't just tell me to stop. He crossed the deck in 3 strides, grabbed the front of my jacket and slammed me against the sorting table. "Don't you ever make that sound again," he'd snarled, his voice a low growl. There was no anger in his eyes, only a raw, primal fear that scared me more than his strength. "The wind plays tricks," he said, letting me go. "It makes echoes of things that shouldn't be here. You don't want to give it a tune to learn." From the bridge, Corbin watched, his face impassive. His silence was the confirmation. Rule number 2. If the sonar displays a false bottom, you kill the screen, you kill the engine, and you wait for it to pass. A false bottom looks like a perfect, ghostly image of the seabed, projected dozens or even hundreds of fathoms deeper than it should be. The textbooks call it a thermocline, or a deep scattering layer. Corbin called it a shadow. Last season we saw one. It appeared without warning, a second, impossibly detailed seafloor on the monitor. The chatter on the bridge stopped cold. Corbin's hand moved with an eerie calm. He hit the power button for the sonar, then pulled the throttle to neutral. We drifted in absolute silence for almost an hour, the only sound the slap of waves against the hull. The crew on deck instinctively knew to stop their work, to stay still. It felt like we were a mouse hiding from a hawk, praying its shadow wouldn't fall on us. Then, just as quietly, Corbin re-engaged the engine and we moved on, leaving whatever had passed beneath us undisturbed in the dark. Rule number 3. Lights on the horizon that do not answer a radio hail are to be ignored. You look at your hands, you look at the deck, you do not look at the light. You think you know loneliness, and then you see a light like that. It's not the steady, reliable blink of another vessel or a buoy. It's a soft, solitary pulse, like a deep-sea firefly that appears where no light should be. It calls to the part of you that's been trapped in the deafening noise and chaos of the boat, promising a quiet, calm alternative. The first time I saw it, I reached for the radio handset. Gunner's heavy hand landed on my shoulder. "That's not for us, kid," he said, his voice soft. "Some things are best left alone. It's a hook, just don't bite." But the final rule, the one that governed the very purpose of our being out there, was the most sacred and the most terrifying. Rule number 4. If a pot comes up empty, but the winch gauge shows it's heavy, you cut the cable. You let the sea keep what it has claimed. It was the ultimate test of faith in Corbin's laws, pitting cold hard profit against unseen dread. For 2 full seasons, it was nothing more than a chilling legend. Until Evan Deckard came aboard. We just called him Deck. He was fresh, arrogant, and desperate to prove that the age of superstition was over. He was fast and strong, but he carried a dangerous disdain for our rituals. He saw Corbin not as a seasoned captain, but as a relic, a man clinging to ghost stories in the face of modern technology. He openly questioned why we'd spend hours changing course for a sonar glitch and logged every gallon of fuel he deemed wasted. He believed the sea was just water, and a man's will was all that was needed to conquer it. Our 3rd week out, the sea decided to teach him otherwise. We were on the edge of a weather system, a wall of black moving in from the west. Corbin was pushing us, the deck lights cutting a frantic, lonely stage in the encroaching darkness. The hydraulic winch screamed its protest against the cold as it hauled another pot from the abyss, a 1/4 mile straight down. The pressure gauge was red-lined, indicating a massive haul, the kind of pot that makes a whole season worthwhile, 1,000 pounds, maybe more. Even the veterans felt a jolt of gold fever. Gunner was at the rail, hook in hand. I was at the sorting table, bracing for the deluge. The giant steel cage breached the surface, shedding a waterfall of black water, and it was empty. The deck fell into a sudden, profound silence, the world shrinking to the sound of the wind and the groaning winch. The pot hung there, a dripping steel skeleton. There was not a single crab, not a starfish, not even a strand of seaweed caught in its mesh. It was perfectly, unnaturally clean. And yet the winch was straining under an immense weight. The cable was stretched so tight it hummed with a low, vibrating frequency. Empty, but full. "Cut it!" The voice from the bridge was a crack of lightning. Corbin sounded different. Not angry, but terrified. "Gunner, cut that damn cable now!" Gunner, his face a sickly white in the deck lights, reached for the heavy-duty bolt cutters. But Deckard stepped in front of him, a defiant sneer on his face. "Are you insane, Captain? That's thousands of dollars in gear. It's just snagged on some debris." "That is a direct order, Deckard. Get away from that line." "Not a chance, old man," Deckard yelled back, his voice thin against the wind. "I'm not throwing away a pot because of your spooky stories." In a move of pure mutiny, he lunged for the winch controls, shoving Gunner aside and slamming the master lever to bring the pot aboard. The cage landed on the steel deck with a deafening final clang that seemed to echo in our very bones. The entire crew recoiled, forming a wide, fearful circle. From the bridge, Corbin didn't move. He just stared down, his face etched with a look of profound, soul-crushing failure. We all stared at the empty cage. Something was inside. Tucked in the corner, clinging to the bars, was a dense, tangled mass. It wasn't kelp, and it wasn't any creature I'd ever seen. It was a cluster of pulsing, organic-looking tubes, the color of a deep bruise, a sickening swirl of purple and black. What was most impossible was that it was warm. In the sub-zero air, a faint steam was rising from it, melting the frost on the deck in a perfect circle around the cage. And there was a sound, a low, soft hum that vibrated up through the soles of our boots, a deep, resonant thrum that felt ancient and alive. "See?" Deckard's voice was shaky, his bravado failing him. "Just some biological crap from the bottom." He kicked the cage and the mass inside seemed to flinch, its humming deepening for a single, sickening beat. Then he committed the final sin. He reached through the bars. His fingertips made contact with the strange, warm surface for no more than a second. He yanked his hand back with a sharp hiss, as if burned. "Feels weird," he muttered, staring at his fingers. "Like static." A strange, glassy look came over his eyes. He blinked slowly, as if waking from a long dream. Corbin finally descended from the bridge, each step heavy and deliberate. He walked past Deckard as if he wasn't there, attached a spare line to the pot, and single-handedly dragged it to the rail. He tipped it over the side without ceremony, and it disappeared into the black water. It made almost no sound as it went. He turned to Deckard, his voice devoid of all emotion. "Get to your bunk. You are confined to quarters." Then he swept his dead-eyed gaze over the rest of us. Back to work. The spell was broken, but the ship was now tainted. The work continued, but it was mechanical, silent. The unspoken camaraderie that keeps a crew alive was gone, replaced by a shared, unspoken dread. The very hum of the ship's engine now sounded different, as if it were trying to harmonize with a new, deeper sound. Deckard missed his next 2 shifts. We assumed Corbin had him on ice, or that he was too ashamed to face us. On the 3rd shift, when he still didn't appear, Corbin sent Gunnar to his cabin. Gunnar returned moments later, his face pale. "Captain, the doors bolted. From the inside." We all went. The cabin was a small steel box in the forward hold. The thick steel door was locked solid. Corbin hammered on it with his fist. "Deckard, open this door now." The only reply was the thrum of the engine and the hiss of waves against the hull. We had to use a pry bar to force the door. With a screech of tortured metal, the lock gave way and the door swung inward. The room was pristine and empty. His bunk was perfectly made. His clothes were folded in his locker. The single, thick glass porthole was screwed shut from the inside, sealed with a layer of frozen sea spray. It was a hermetically sealed container, and the man inside had vanished. He hadn't fallen overboard. He had evaporated. As the others stood in stunned, horrified silence, I knelt down, my mind refusing to process what my eyes were seeing. I pressed my hand, then my ear, against the cold steel floor plates of the corridor. And I heard it, faint but clear. It wasn't just the engine anymore. It was coming from everywhere, from the very structure of the vessel. A deep, low, resonant hum. The same hum from the cage. It hadn't left with the pot. We had brought it aboard. It was inside the Boreas. It was inside our world. Losing a man to the sea is a risk we all accept, but to lose one to thin air from a locked room is a violation of all known laws. It's a message. We are not alone in these waters, and whatever was in that cage is now with us. If you want to understand the truth of what we brought aboard this ship, subscribe to this feed, share this recording. The darkness under the ice has a voice, and it's beginning to speak. I don't know how much time we have left before it demands an answer from all of us. The immediate aftermath of a discovery like that is a strange and silent thing. There is no screaming, no panic. The human mind simply refuses to accept a reality it is not equipped to process. We stood there, 6 men in a cramped hallway, staring into an empty room that should have contained a 7th. The air grew thick and heavy, each man lost in his own private vortex of disbelief. It was Corbin who broke the spell. His voice, when it came, was flat, devoid of any emotion, like a machine giving a command. "Seal it." We didn't use a lock. Gunnar, his face a stony mask of grim obedience, brought a portable welder and fused the door to its frame. The hiss of the torch and the acrid smell of burning paint were the only sounds. It was a funeral rite. We were entombing a ghost, or perhaps we were sealing a contamination, trying to convince ourselves that whatever had claimed Deckard could be contained by a bead of molten steel. That act fractured the crew of the Boreas permanently. The unspoken pact of shared hardship evaporated, replaced by a creeping, corrosive paranoia. We were no longer a crew, we were a collection of isolated minds, trapped together on a floating prison. Sleep became a luxury none of us could afford. Every creak of the hull, every slap of a wave was now suspect. The boat had a new secret sound, the hum, and I was the only one who seemed to acknowledge its existence. It was a constant, low-frequency vibration that had woven itself into the fabric of the ship. I felt it in my bunk when I tried to sleep, a thrumming that resonated deep in my chest. I heard it in the galley, a faint tremor in my coffee cup. It was the ship's new heartbeat, and it was driving me insane. My investigation began where logic had ended. Deckard's sealed tomb. During my next off shift, while the others were on deck, I went to the cabin. The fresh weld on the door was a raw, ugly scar. I couldn't get in, but there was a small ventilation grate near the floor. Lying on my stomach, the cold of the steel deck seeping through my clothes, I shone my flashlight through the slats. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the sterile, impossible scene. Everything was just as we'd left it. The neatly made bunk, the footlocker, the impossibly small porthole. But my light caught something on the small, fold-down desk, a notepad. It took me an hour of painstaking work with a piece of stiff wire, my fingers growing numb, to hook the spiral binding and drag it across the floor toward the vent. When I finally pulled it through, its pages felt cold and heavy with significance. I expected a letter, an explanation, a confession. What I found was far more disturbing. The first few pages were filled with mundane notes, shift schedules, debt calculations, a list of things he planned to buy when he got back to shore. But the last 3 pages were different. They were covered in frantic, obsessive drawings. They were complex, geometric patterns, like snowflakes designed by a madman, spirals that coiled into themselves, intricate webs of intersecting lines, shapes that seemed to hold more dimensions than they should. And on the very last page, there was only one thing, a single word scrawled over and over again, the pencil having torn through the paper in several places. Humming, humming, humming. The validation sent a chill down my spine that had nothing to do with the temperature. I wasn't imagining it. Deckard had heard it too. He had been listening to it, and in his final hours, he had tried to draw its shape. The patterns, were they a representation of the sound? A language? Armed with this terrifying confirmation, I tried to breach the wall of silence that had descended between the crew. I found Gunnar alone in the engine room, the roar of the diesel generators a temporary shield from the oppressive quiet of the ship. I showed him the notepad. He glanced at the pages, his jaw tightening, and then pushed my hand away. "You need to drop this, Liam," he said, his voice a low rumble beneath the engine's noise. "You're asking questions that'll sink this boat faster than any iceberg." He heard it too, Gunnar. The humming. It's real. "Some things are real and shouldn't be," he countered, his eyes refusing to meet mine. "You're a good fisherman. Stick to that. Forget what you saw. Forget Deckard. He broke the rules. The sea took him. That's the end of the story." He was shutting me out, not with anger, but with a deep, weary resignation, as if he were guarding a secret he wished he didn't know. The younger crewmen were no better. They were spooked, huddled together, speaking in whispers. They preferred a simpler, more palatable explanation. Deckard had gone mad from the isolation, a classic case of cabin fever. They rationalized that he must have found a way to squeeze through the porthole, a feat of suicidal desperation. They would believe any lie before they would confront the impossible truth. I was utterly alone in my search. My focus shifted to the only man who wasn't hiding from the truth, but enforcing its boundaries. Captain Corbin. He had become a phantom, spending nearly all his time on the bridge, his silhouette a constant, lonely figure against the grey wash of the sea. His silence was not one of fear, but of grim, focused vigilance. He was watching for something, waiting for it. I began to watch him. I tracked his routines, his brief trips to the galley for coffee, his short, restless naps. I knew I had to get into the bridge's chart room. It was the one place on the vessel that was his private sanctuary. My chance came during a shift change, when a minor hydraulic leak on deck demanded everyone's attention, including the captain's. Slipping onto the bridge felt like a desecration. The air was thick with the scent of stale coffee and ozone from the electronics. And there on the chart table, laid open as if he'd been recently consulting it, was not a standard naval logbook, but a thick, leather-bound journal. Its pages were yellowed and brittle with age, filled with Corbin's precise, almost microscopic handwriting. It wasn't just the log of the Boreas, it was a generational record. The first entry was dated 1952, written by a man I assumed was Corbin's father. It chronicled decades of fishing in these same waters, but the entries were interspersed with cryptic, chilling observations. November 1968. The Odessa went silent after reporting a singing winch cable. No wreckage found. The pattern holds. October 1975. Sonar shows the shadow again, larger this time. We are marking the coordinates. These areas must be left fallow. It seems to be listening. December 1987. Lost a man, a greenhorn named Peters. Same circumstances as the stories from grandfather. He brought a heavy pot aboard. The resonance is the key. It communicates through sympathetic vibration. We must not provide an instrument. It was a litany of terror, a secret history of this patch of ocean. The Corbins were not just fishermen. They were sentinels. They were the guardians of a terrible secret, and the rules were not superstition. They were a containment protocol. A protocol Deckard had shattered. As I was reading, a crackle from the ship's main radio startled me. It was set to scan open frequencies, and it had locked onto something. At first it was just static, a wall of white noise. Then, a voice began to emerge from the hash, faint and distorted. "Help me. So cold. The floor is..." My blood turned to ice. It was Deckard's voice. Humming. I can hear the humming. The voice was a broken loop, interspersed with the shriek of twisting metal and a wet, popping sound. It wasn't a live transmission, it was a recording, a grotesque echo. It was as if something had captured his last moments and was now playing them back over the open airwaves, a predator playing with its food. I lunged for the radio to shut it off, but the voice changed. It morphed, the cadence stretching and contorting into something utterly inhuman. The words dissolved into a series of guttural clicks and deep, resonant moans, a language that vibrated with the same frequency as the hum in the ship's hull. It was the entity. It was learning to speak, using the dead man's voice as its primer. The next 2 days were a descent into a new kind of hell. The voice became a constant companion, a ghost in the machine. It would broadcast at random intervals, sometimes mimicking our own voices, snippets of conversations from the deck played back with subtle, disturbing distortions. Trust, already a scarce commodity, completely disintegrated. Men started accusing each other of tampering with the radio, of playing a sick joke. Corbin tried to restore order by locking us out of the bridge, but it was useless. The voice started coming through the ship-wide intercom system, its alien syntax punctuated by bursts of Deckard's terrified pleas. We abandoned our fishing grounds, steaming east toward the nearest shipping lanes, running from the unseen horror. But it was not to be shaken. I was on watch on the bridge, staring at the sonar display with a sense of fatalistic dread when it appeared. The false bottom, a perfect, ghostly echo of the seabed, 100 fathoms below the true one. "Change course," Corbin ordered, his voice strained. I spun the wheel, turning us due south. The shadow on the screen moved with us. I changed course again, heading northeast. It mirrored my turn perfectly. It wasn't a static geographical feature. It was an object impossibly large, and it was pacing us, hunting us. The tool we used to map the abyss was now showing us the contours of the leviathan that lived within it. The sea was no longer our environment. It was its body. And we were a foreign microbe it was now actively tracking. The final stage of the psychological assault began that night. The physical boundaries of the ship started to feel permeable. A strange smell like ozone and low-tide brine began to permeate the interior cabins, even with the ventilation system sealed against the storm that was now gathering. Then came the sounds. A soft, rhythmic scratching that seemed to come from directly beneath my bunk, from the other side of the hull. A sound that was impossible, miles from any land or ice. It was the sound of claws on steel, a patient, exploratory scraping. I fled the claustrophobia of my cabin for the open deck, hoping the freezing wind would clear my head. The storm was still gathering, the waves building into monstrous slate-gray mountains. I was clinging to the rail, my face numb from the spray, when I saw it. At the far end of the bow, partially obscured by the mist from a crashing wave, was a figure. It was silhouetted against the deck lights, roughly the shape of a man, but it moved all wrong. It scurried on all fours for a few feet with an insect-like speed before rising again to its full height. It was thin, unnaturally so, its limbs too long. It turned its head in my direction, a slow, jerky motion, and though I could see no face, I felt the weight of its attention, an ancient and utterly malevolent curiosity. I squeezed my eyes shut, then opened them again. It was gone. Was it a hallucination? A trick of the light? born from sleep deprivation and terror? Or had the thing we brought up from the depths finally learned how to come aboard? The line between the world outside the ship and the horrors inside my own mind had been erased. The scratching was not just on the hull anymore, it was inside my skull. The human mind has a fail-safe, a circuit breaker for terror. When confronted with an impossibility, it retreats into the mundane. I didn't scream, I didn't run. I simply backed away from the rail, my boots crunching on the icy deck, and walked back into the relative sanity of the ship's interior. The image of that lanky, disjointed figure was seared onto the inside of my eyelids, but my brain was already trying to explain it away. A trick of the light, a wave breaking in a strange shape. A hallucination born from days without real sleep. But I knew, deep in the marrow of my bones, I knew I had just seen one of the ship's new passengers. My first instinct was to find Gunnar. He was the keeper of the old ways, the bridge between Corbin's cryptic laws and the crew's ignorance. I found him in the galley, methodically cleaning a coffee percolator, his large hands moving with a slow, deliberate grace that defied the chaos enveloping us. "There was something on the bow," I said, my voice coming out as a harsh whisper. "A man, but it wasn't a man. It moved wrong." Gunnar didn't look up from his work. He continued scrubbing the stainless steel, his knuckles white. "The sea plays tricks, Liam. The spray freezes in the air, makes shapes. You're tired. We're all tired." "This wasn't ice, Gunnar," I pressed, my voice rising. "It was watching me. It was there and then it was gone." He finally stopped, placing the percolator down with a soft, final click. He looked at me, and in his eyes I saw not disbelief, but a profound and terrible pity. "Then you will do well to forget what you saw," he said, his voice barely audible over the ship's groan. "There are things in the deep places of the world that sometimes rise. Our job is not to see them. Our job is to survive them. Go to your bunk. Try to sleep." His denial was more terrifying than any confirmation. It was the denial of a man who had seen it before. He was part of the secret, a reluctant priest in Corbin's silent order. There would be no help from him. There would be no help from anyone. I was alone with the knowledge, and the knowledge was a cancer. Sleep was an impossibility. In the suffocating confines of my cabin, I laid out the artifacts of our damnation. Deckard's notebook and my memory of Corbin's ancestral log. The log had spoken of a resonance, a sympathetic vibration. Deckard had written one word, over and over, humming. He hadn't just heard it, he had been obsessed by it. I stared at the geometric patterns he had drawn, the intricate, snowflake-like shapes that seemed to mock the laws of perspective. They were not random doodles. They were a message. But what did they mean? My eyes fell upon the small secondary sonar display near my bunk, a repeater from the bridge. It was still active, and the false bottom, the shadow that followed us, was still there, a persistent, ghostly echo of the true seabed. I watched its undulating line, the digital representation of an impossible topography, and then I saw it. A connection so sudden and so horrifying, it stole the breath from my lungs. I snatched Deckard's notebook and held it next to the screen. A specific section of the sonar's line, a jagged peak followed by a gentle sloping valley, was a perfect mirrored match for one of the patterns Deckard had drawn. I flipped through the pages. Another pattern, a tight spiral, corresponded to a place on the chart where the sonar echo had seemed to intensify. The drawings were not of the sound. They were a map of the entity itself. Deckard, in his final hours, as the resonance saturated his mind, had not been descending into madness. He had been performing an act of cartography. He had been charting the contours of our new god. This revelation changed everything. The phenomena were not random acts of a chaotic entity. They were structured, deliberate. They were a language. And if it was a language, it had rules, it had a syntax. I was a fisherman, a navigator. My entire life was about understanding patterns, the tides, the weather, the movement of the crab. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt a sliver of my old self return. Fear was replaced by a cold, razor-sharp obsession. I would not be a passive victim. I would be an analyst. My first experiment was with the ship's frequency. The log mentioned resonance. I knew the ship's twin diesel engines had a specific harmonic output, a frequency that could be subtly altered by adjusting the RPMs of the port and starboard propellers. During my next watch, feigning a routine diagnostic, I made a minute adjustment, lowering the port engine's RPMs by a fraction, creating a slight dissonance, a wobble in the ship's constant hum. The response was immediate. The soft, exploratory scratching against the hull ceased. For a full minute there was an unnerving silence. Then it returned, but it was different. It was faster, more agitated, a frantic, rhythmic tapping that sounded less like claws and more like a code. It was responding to the change. It was telling me it had noticed. A cold sweat broke out on my neck. I had just taught a Leviathan a new trick. I had rung a bell, and the thing in the cage below had salivated. My next test was the radio. I understood now that it wasn't just a receiver for the entity's grotesque broadcasts. It was a stimulus. During the deepest part of the night, I went to the bridge. The intercom was silent, but the air itself felt charged, expectant. I powered up the secondary comms unit, a shortwave transmitter, and instead of hailing, I sent out a simple, contentless pulse. A single burst of pure carrier wave. The ship's main intercom crackled to life, but this time, it was not Deckard's voice. It was a woman, humming a lullaby, a tune I hadn't heard in 20 years, a song my mother used to sing to me when I was a child, sick with a fever. It was a memory that existed only inside my own head. The lullaby was clear for only a few bars. Then it began to warp. The gentle melody was interwoven with the alien clicks and pops, the notes bending into microtones that made the muscles in my jaw ache. It was a violation of the most profound kind. The entity was not just in the water or in the ship. It was somehow in me. It had access to my memories. It was sifting through my mind, through my soul, looking for a sound that I would understand, and it was twisting it into its own alien grammar. It was demonstrating its intelligence, its reach, and its utter contempt for the sanctity of my own consciousness. My expertise, once my shield against the chaos of the sea, now became my torture. I am a navigator. I know the sky. On the first night the storm clouds briefly parted, I took a sextant reading, an old habit. The stars were wrong, not wildly out of place, but subtly, impossibly shifted. Polaris, the constant, the anchor of all northern navigation, was a fraction of a degree to the west of where it should have been. It was a celestial error so profound, it was like discovering the number 2 had decided to become a 3. The universe, the one I had memorized and trusted, was being edited around us. Time itself began to fray at the edges. The ship's master chronometer, a hyper-accurate atomic clock, started losing sync with my own wristwatch. At first it was seconds, then minutes. We were sailing into a bubble of warped reality, a place where the fundamental laws of physics were becoming mere suggestions. The entity wasn't just following us. It was rewriting the world in our immediate vicinity. The final proof of its intelligent, malevolent nature came 2 days later. The storm we had been outrunning finally broke, but it was replaced by something worse. An unnatural fog, thick as cotton and glowing with a faint sickly green phosphorescence, enveloped the Boreas. It blinded our radar and choked our visibility down to 0. We were adrift in an ethereal sea, completely disconnected from the world. Our GPS, which had been flickering for hours, finally gave up, its screen showing our location as a point in the geographic center of North America. The crew was on the verge of total collapse. Hope, a currency we had been spending carefully, was gone. Then a miracle. A new contact appeared on the secondary radar, the one I knew still worked intermittently. An island. A small, crescent-shaped piece of land, dead ahead. The screen showed a clear, solid mass. Salvation. A cheer went through the men. Even Gunnar allowed himself a brief, grim smile. Landfall. A chance to anchor, to repair, to be on solid ground. Only Corbin, standing on the bridge, remained rigid, his face a mask of cold terror. I looked at the radar, then at the other instruments. The barometer was still falling, indicating a storm of impossible magnitude. The sea, however, was unnaturally calm. The air that drifted in from the island didn't carry the scent of rock and earth, but the same cloying smell of ozone and brine from inside the ship. My blood ran cold. "It's a lure," I said to Corbin, my voice flat. "The light on the horizon, rule number 3. This is the same thing, just bigger." Corbin finally looked at me, his eyes acknowledging me as a peer in this nightmare for the first time. "You are wrong," he said, his voice a dry rasp. "The light is a lure, a simple trap for the unwary. This is an invitation. It has studied us. It has learned our desires. It knows that land is our symbol for safety. It is not trying to trick us. It is testing us. It wants to see if we are intelligent enough to understand the nature of the invitation and refuse." He gave the order to steer hard to port, to skirt the edge of the radar contact. As the Boreas slowly turned, the edge of the glowing fog bank peeled away for a single horrifying moment, granting us a clear view of the island. It was not land. There was no rock, no soil, no vegetation. Rising from the placid black water was a colossal structure of the same bruised purple organic material we had seen in the pot. It was a mountain of living flesh, acres wide, covered in the same intricate geometric patterns as Deckard's drawings, each line and spiral pulsing with a soft internal luminescence. We were not looking at an island. We were looking at a surfaced part of the continental entity itself. The radar signal had been a lie, a psychic projection designed to appeal to the most primitive parts of our brains. This was its true form, a cathedral of alien biology, silently waiting for us. We had passed the test. We had refused the invitation. As we sailed away, I knew with a certainty that chilled me to my soul that this was no longer a haunting. We were not being hunted. It was something far more intimate and far more terrifying. This was a courtship, and we had just been formally introduced. Our refusal of the island was not an escape. It was a choice of damnation. The moment the last phosphorescent peak of that living mountain sank beneath the unnatural fog, the sea around us changed. The placid black water, which had been so deceptively calm, began to writhe. It did not form waves, not in any natural sense. Instead, the surface of the ocean buckled and warped, rising into steep angular plains that collapsed in on themselves without foam or spray. It was as if we were sailing not on water, but on the flexing skin of some immense, dreaming creature. The Boreas was no longer cutting through the sea. It was being carried, a passive object in the grip of an incomprehensible tide. The unnatural fog did not dissipate. It clung to us, condensing on every surface not as water, but as a thin, greasy film that smelled faintly of ammonia and decay. The storm that the barometer had been predicting for days finally arrived, but it was a tempest of a different order of reality. The rain, when it came, was thick and oily, streaking the windows of the bridge with iridescent patterns. The wind did not howl. It produced a low guttural moan that seemed to emanate from all directions at once, a sound that carried within it the discordant harmony of the hum. We were cut off. The world we knew, the world of predictable physics, of reliable stars, of a sky that was separate from the sea, was gone. We were sealed inside a bubble of alien cosmology, a pocket universe governed by the whims of the intelligence below. The isolation was no longer a matter of distance. It was a fundamental state of being. We were as far from home as a ship that had sailed off the edge of a flat earth. The true siege began on the second day of the storm. It was no longer a question of external threats. The entity had found the fissures in our minds and was now prying them open with surgical precision. The attack vector was memory. It was love. It started with Jensen, the youngest of the crew, barely 20. I found him standing on the aft deck in the driving, oily rain, staring out into the churning chaos. He was talking to it. "I know, Mom," he was saying, his voice choked with emotion. "I'll be home soon. I promise. I'll make you proud." I followed his gaze. For a fleeting second, I saw her. A woman, her form sculpted from the swirling mist and unnatural rain, stood on the crest of a shearing wave. She was beckoning to him, a faint, sad smile on her translucent face. The image dissolved as another plane of black water folded over it, but the psychic imprint remained. Jensen had seen his mother, calling him home to the depths. It became a contagion. Each man was visited by his own private ghosts. Gunnar, the stoic rock of our crew, was found tracing patterns on a frosted porthole, whispering a woman's name in Norwegian. Torres, a quiet man who kept to himself, began having frantic, one-sided conversations in Spanish, arguing with a brother I later learned had died years ago in a car crash. The entity was using our own hearts as weapons against us. It was a form of psychological warfare so advanced, so deeply cruel, that it felt less like an attack and more like a process of deconstruction. It was taking us apart, piece by piece, by reminding us of a world we could no longer be sure was real. The shared reality of the ship dissolved, replaced by 6 private overlapping hells. My own visitation came during a brief, exhausted lull in my watch. I saw the silhouette of my father, who had been a fisherman his entire life, standing by the rail where Deckard had brought the pot aboard. He wasn't beckoning. He was just looking at me, his face etched with a profound and terrible disappointment, as if he knew I had seen something I shouldn't have, that I had failed some ancient, unspoken duty. The apparition didn't speak, but its message was clear in the cold finality of its stare. You have let it out. The pressure built. The line between what was real and what was a projection of the entity's will blurred into non-existence. We began to see each other differently. A trick of the light would make a crewmate's eyes seem to glow with that same sickly green phosphorescence from the fog. A familiar voice would suddenly carry the alien, resonant undertone of the hum. We were no longer sure who was who. Was the man standing next to me my crewmate, or was it a perfect mimic, a puppet of flesh animated by the intelligence below? The breaking point was Torres. His arguments with his dead brother had grown more and more agitated. He stopped sleeping entirely, his eyes sinking back into his skull, 2 black pits of terror and suspicion. His gaze became fixed on Jensen. He would watch him across the galley, silent and unblinking, for hours. He saw the phantoms too, but his fractured mind had found a different explanation. They were not ghosts. They were a symptom of an infection, and Jensen, he believed, was the source. The violence erupted without warning. We were in the galley, the ship lurching through the impossible sea, when Torres simply stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. He held a long steel filleting knife in his hand. "It's you," he whispered, his eyes locked on Jensen. "You brought them here. I can hear them in your voice. I can hear the humming inside you." Jensen, pale and terrified, pushed his chair back. "What are you talking about, man?" "It's me. It's Jensen." "No," Torres hissed, taking a slow step forward. "Your eyes are wrong. The shape is right, but the light inside is wrong. You're a shell. It's wearing you." He lunged. Gunnar, moving with a speed that belied his size, intercepted him, catching his knife hand in a crushing grip. The knife clattered to the floor. Torres didn't fight. He simply collapsed, all the tension leaving his body, and began to sob, a dry, racking sound of a mind that had been utterly hollowed out. He was gone. The man was a shell, but it wasn't the entity that had hollowed him out. It was the fear. We locked him in a storage closet, for his own safety and ours. As Gunnar and I secured the door, Corbin appeared behind me, his presence a sudden pocket of cold resolve in the chaos. He placed a heavy hand on my shoulder. "Keller, the bridge." Now. I followed him up the ladder into the storm-lashed nerve center of the Boreas. The world outside the reinforced windows was a maelstrom of black water and glowing fog. Corbin stood before the main chart table, his back to me for a long moment. When he finally turned, his face looked ancient, like a rock that had been eroded by 1,000 years of relentless tides. "You see it, don't you?" he said. It wasn't a question. "You don't just feel the fear. You see the pattern, the island, the stars. You understand." I could only nod, my throat tight. "My family has been fishing these waters for over a century," he began, his voice a low, gravelly confession. "We are not fishermen, Keller. Not really. We are custodians. This vessel, and the one my father captained before it, and his father before him, they are tools, part of a system." He unrolled an old yellowed chart, weighted down with brass rulers. It was a map of this sector of the Bering Sea, but it was covered in handwritten annotations, in symbols and lines that were not part of any naval convention. "We call it the Protocol of Boreas," he said, his finger tracing a large circular area on the chart that encompassed our current nightmarish position. "The rules are not superstitions. They are a containment procedure, a series of ritualistic behaviors designed to minimize our acoustic and psychic footprint. They are meant to keep the presence here dormant, unaware. He looked me straight in the eyes, the winter sky blue of them filled with a terrible clarity. We are not its keepers. We are its jailers, or perhaps more accurately, we are the blind gardeners who tend the soil around a sleeping volcano, praying our footsteps don't wake it. The hum is its dream. The false bottom is the edge of its slumbering mind. For 100 years, my family has navigated these waters, making our living on the periphery, never disturbing the dream, ensuring this thing remained ignorant of the larger world. He pointed to a specific set of coordinates on the chart. This is where Deckard pulled up the pot. It's a thin place, a nexus point where the boundary between its dream and our reality is permeable. What he brought aboard was not a piece of it. It was a nerve ending, a sensory organ sent to investigate a disturbance. The pieces of the puzzle clicked into place in my mind, forming a picture of such cosmic horror that I felt a wave of vertigo. When Deckard brought it aboard, I whispered, it was like a sleeping man touching a hot stove. Worse, Corbin corrected, his voice grim. It was like a creature that never knew it had a body suddenly discovering it possessed a sense of touch. And when he touched it, when he completed the circuit between his consciousness and its own, it did not just learn of him. It learned from him. It learned of us. Our language, our fears, our memories, our concept of a world beyond the ice and the dark. Deckard's arrogance didn't just kill him, it was a flare, an announcement of our existence sent into a darkness we cannot possibly comprehend. The protocol has failed. Containment is broken. The thing in the deep is no longer just dreaming. It is waking up. Corbin's confession did not hang in the air of the bridge. It condensed, becoming a part of the greasy film on the windows, a new layer to the oppressive atmosphere. The generational weight of his family's secret settled onto my shoulders, a crushing mantle of knowledge. We were not victims of a random encounter. We were failed custodians at the end of a century-long watch. The storm outside raged with a new personal fury, as if the entity below, now fully attentive, was focusing its nascent consciousness upon the small point of light and defiance that was the Boreas. The revelation provided context, but offered no solace. In fact, it was worse. To be hunted by a mindless monster is a simple terror. To have attracted the focused, analytical curiosity of a god is a horror of a different magnitude entirely. The psychological phenomena intensified. The ship was no longer just a haunted house. It was a conscious extension of the entity's will. Doors would unlock and swing open to reveal corridors that shimmered and warped, the steel bulkheads momentarily taking on the bruised purple organic texture of the thing below. The hum was no longer a subtle vibration. It was a constant, audible presence, a chorus of alien thought that vibrated at the edge of hearing, planting geometric patterns and impossible colors directly into our minds. The rest of the crew were lost. Jensen had retreated into a catatonic state, curled in a corner of the galley, his eyes wide and vacant, occasionally whispering apologies to the phantoms only he could see. The other two men, a pair of seasoned fishermen named Mac and Chen, had barricaded themselves in their cabin, convinced that Gunnar and I were no longer human. Through the door we could hear them chanting prayers, their voices a thin, desperate thread against the overwhelming moan of the storm. Torres remained in the storage locker, his silence somehow more menacing than his earlier outburst. The ship itself was dying. The impossible stresses being exerted on the hull had opened a dozen small leaks, and the constant rhythmic shuddering of the unnatural sea was playing havoc with the engine. The generators were sputtering, causing the lights to flicker in a frantic, syncopated rhythm with the hum. We were running out of time, not just mentally but physically. The Boreas was being unmade around us. It was in this crucible of utter despair that Corbin's new insane purpose was forged. He stood over the annotated chart, his face illuminated by the sickly green glow from the fog-shrouded windows. "The old protocol is void," he stated, his voice a low, steady rumble against the chaos. Avoidance, silence, ignorance. These were the tools for keeping a dreamer asleep. But we are dealing with a waking mind now. It is studying us, testing our responses. Every action we take, including inaction, is a new data point for it. He looked up from the chart, his gaze meeting mine with a terrifying intensity. We cannot run, we cannot hide. There is only one path left. We must change the nature of the conversation. What conversation? I asked, my voice hoarse. It's screaming at us in a language made of our own nightmares. Exactly, Corbin said, a strange, feverish light in his eyes. It is using what it learned from Deckard, disjointed fragments of human consciousness, to communicate. But we have something Deckard didn't. We have the source code, the original resonance, the pure hum from the pot. His finger tapped the chart. We're going to send it a message it understands. We are going to speak back. The sheer suicidal audacity of the idea was staggering. All the rules, a century of carefully cultivated fear and avoidance, were designed to prevent exactly this, a direct, intentional acknowledgement of the entity. But I saw the grim logic in his madness. Passivity was a death sentence. At least this way we would die on our own terms, pulling the temple down with us. Our instrument would be the deep scan sonar, not as a listening device, but as a broadcast antenna. The plan was to bypass the machine's standard frequency limiters, overclock the pulse generator by rerouting auxiliary power from the main engine, and modulate the output to precisely match the frequency and cadence of the hum that now saturated the ship. We would, in essence, turn the entire vessel into a tuning fork, struck to resonate with the mind of the Leviathan. Gunnar found us in the engine room, tearing into the sonar's primary control panel. He stood in the doorway, a massive, sorrowful silhouette against the flickering lights of the corridor. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice heavy with a weary dread. "We're sending a signal," I said, not looking up from a tangle of wires. "No," Gunnar said, stepping into the room. The steel deck plate groaned under his weight. "The only rule that matters now is the first one my grandfather learned from yours, Captain. You do not answer. You do not acknowledge. You endure the storm and pray it loses interest. To answer is to invite it in." "It's already in, Gunnar," Corbin countered, his voice sharp. "It's in the walls, it's in our heads, and it's tearing this ship apart. Your grandfather's rules apply to a sleeping giant. Ours is awake and looking at us. We are insects under a lens. Our only hope is to prove we are something more than just insects. By showing it where the rest of the anthill is?" Gunnar's voice was filled with a chilling, logical fear. "You think it will be impressed, or will it just be hungry? You will doom us all. You will doom everyone back on shore. This is not our secret to share." He moved to intercept Corbin, his intention clear. He would break the equipment before he let us use it. But before he could take a second step, a high-frequency shriek erupted from the ship's intercom system, a sound of such piercing, agonizing intensity that we all clamped our hands over our ears. The lights in the engine room exploded in a shower of sparks, plunging us into a darkness punctuated only by the red glow of emergency lamps. The shriek stopped as suddenly as it began. In the ensuing silence, a new sound emerged from the intercom, a soft, wet, tearing noise, followed by the splintering of wood. It was coming from the direction of the forward cabins, where Mac and Chen were barricaded. Then came the screaming. It was a choked, terrified sound that was cut off with a sickening final gurgle. Then silence. A profound, listening silence. The message was unambiguous. The entity had been observing our conflict. It had chosen a side. It wanted us to proceed. Gunnar stood frozen, his face a mask of horror and defeat. The fight was gone from him, replaced by the hollow resignation of a man who has just witnessed the wrath of his god. He slowly backed out of the engine room and was gone, a ghost retreating into the haunted passageways of his tomb. We worked for the next hour with a frantic, desperate focus. The ship itself seemed to be fighting us, the hum rising in pitch and intensity, causing tools to vibrate out of our hands and our vision to blur at the edges. But we were driven by a purpose beyond fear. We jury-rigged a bypass, pulling power directly from one of the main drive shafts. The lights of the entire ship dimmed as we channeled its lifeblood into the sonar array. We returned to the bridge to deliver our message. The scene was apocalyptic. Through the windows, the world was a vortex of black water and green-tinged fog. The rhythmic lurching of the ship had become a violent, chaotic bucking. On the edge of the bridge, Jensen was rocking back and forth, humming the distorted lullaby the entity had stolen from my mind. Corbin stood before the sonar console, which glowed with a dangerous, overloaded light. "It's ready," he said. He had a small audio recorder in his hand. He had managed to capture a clean, isolated sample of the primary hum. "We'll feed this into the modulator. It will be a perfect echo of its own voice." A question. "What question are we asking, Captain?" I asked, my hand gripping the rail to stay upright. "We are asking," he said, his eyes fixed on the console, his face illuminated by its infernal glow. "What are you?" He pressed the button. There was no sound, not in the air. But I felt it. A tremor that started at the base of my skull and shot down my spine. The ship gave a single violent shudder, as if a colossal bell had been struck deep within its hull. The hum, the storm, the moaning of the wind, everything stopped. An absolute, perfect and terrifying silence descended. The fog outside the windows did not just dissipate, it evaporated in an instant, as if a light had been switched on. The churning, impossible sea became a sheet of polished black glass. The sky, which had been a ceiling of roiling black clouds, was now utterly clear, filled with a billion stars of such impossible brightness and clarity that they seemed close enough to touch. The celestial sphere was breathtakingly beautiful, and it was utterly wrong. I saw constellations that no human has ever seen, swirling nebulae of colors that have no name, and dark patches between the stars that seemed to suck the light from the space around them. The response did not come as a sound or a vision. It came as knowledge, a torrent of pure, raw information flooding into my mind, bypassing all my senses. It was a billion years of existence, of memory, of being, downloaded into my consciousness in a single, timeless moment. I did not see it. I was it. I felt the initial impact, the cataclysmic arrival in a young, molten world. A being not of matter, but of thought and resonance, exiled from a universe of pure geometry, now trapped in the chaotic flesh of a cooling planet. I felt the slow, patient eons of its slumber, the shaping of the world not through force, but through the passive influence of its dreaming mind. I felt the tectonic plates shift as it turned in its sleep. I felt the ocean currents coalesce, following the rhythm of its slow, cosmic respiration. I felt the planet's magnetic field snap into place, an aura generated by the sheer power of its contained consciousness. I felt life emerge in the shallow waters, not as an accident of chemistry, but as a byproduct of its dreams. Tiny, complex thoughts given physical form. The flora, the fauna, the entire biosphere of the planet was nothing but the shed skin of its subconscious, a sprawling, complex ecosystem that was utterly unaware of the mind that had dreamed it into existence. And then I felt humanity, a recent noisy and chaotic phenomenon, a frantic proliferation of self-aware bacteria scurrying across the surface of its skin. For millennia we had been beneath its notice, our collective thoughts and fears nothing more than a faint static hiss, lost in the deep dream. Until now, our signal, our perfect resonant question, was not a whisper. It was the focused, coherent shout of a fellow sapient being. We had, in a single moment, announced our existence. We had proven that we were not just part of the dream. We were a second dreamer. The flood of information ceased. The bridge was silent, save for the quiet hum of the now idling electronics. The terrifyingly beautiful alien sky still blazed outside. I turned to Corbin. He was standing rigid, his hand still on the console, a single tear tracing a path through the grime on his cheek. His eyes were wide open, but they were not seeing the bridge. They were fixed on the billion-year vista that had just been burned into our souls. His mind, the mind of a man who had spent his life guarding a locked door, had been shattered by the revelation of what lay behind it. "Captain?" I whispered. He didn't respond. A thin line of blood trickled from his nose. The custodian's watch was over. The knowledge he had inherited, the truth he had sought, had obliterated him. I was alone, but I was not. The connection was open. The silence from the deep was not an absence of sound. It was the silence of a vast and ancient mind that had just opened its eyes, turned its full attention toward the surface for the first time, and was now contemplating the new, impossible fact of us. The silence on the bridge of the Boreas was not an absence of sound. It was a presence, a deep, listening void that had replaced the storm and the hum. The alien starlight pouring through the windows was cold and analytical, painting the scene in hyper-realistic detail. Corbin stood frozen, a statue of a man whose soul had been sandblasted away by revelation. The trickle of blood from his nose was the only movement, a dark tear on a marble effigy. His body was here, but the man, the captain, the custodian, the last of his line, was gone. His consciousness scattered across 1 billion years of alien memory. My own mind was a battlefield. The knowledge that had been forced into me was not a memory I could access, but a fundamental change to the architecture of my being. My perception had been irrevocably altered. I could feel the ship, not as a collection of steel plates and wires, but as a single tired entity. I could feel the immense placid weight of the water beneath us, a pressure that was no longer just physical, but psychic. And I could feel the new, attentive consciousness below, a planetary mind that now knew my name. I was a single nerve cell that had just become aware of the brain it belonged to. I moved, my limbs feeling strangely disconnected, clumsy. I checked on Jensen. The boy was gone. Not vanished like Deckard, but simply empty. He was still humming the lullaby, a perfect melodic loop, but his eyes were milky and unfocused. His mind had been wiped clean, the melody the only thing left recorded on the wax. He was a human music box, and the entity had wound him up one last time. The forward cabins were a scene of quiet carnage. The barricade Mac and Chen had built was splintered, the door ripped from its hinges. Inside, the two men lay in their bunks. There were no marks on them, no signs of violence. They appeared to be sleeping peacefully. But the air was thick with the smell of ozone, and I knew with an instinctive certainty that whatever had made them scream was still inside them. Their minds had been turned inside out, and they had drowned in the abyss of their own skulls. And Gunnar. I found him on the main deck, sitting with his back against the winch that had started it all. He was looking out at the impossible, star-dusted horizon, his face calm, almost serene. In his lap was the bolt cutter he had failed to use on the Pot's cable. He had used it on himself, a final desperate act to sever a connection he could no longer endure. A final adherence to the old protocol. Silence at any cost. I was the only one left, the sole coherent point of consciousness on a vessel adrift in an alien sea. Why me? Was my mind more resilient, or was it simply more compatible? As if in answer to my unspoken question, the world began to return. It did not happen gradually. The alien sky folded in on itself, the impossible constellations retracting like a collapsing umbrella. For a terrifying moment, the absolute blackness of the void was all that existed, and then the familiar, hated grey ceiling of the Bering Sea slammed back into place. The oily storm returned in a final, violent spasm, shaking the Boreas with a convulsive shudder. Then, as quickly as it had returned, the storm broke. The unnatural fog dissolved into a clean, cold mist. The waves subsided into a weary, rolling swell, and the radio crackled. For a moment it was just static. Then a voice, a human voice, clear and blessedly mundane, cut through. "Boreas, this is US Coast Guard cutter Helios. We have your emergency beacon. Do you copy, Boreas? Rescue." The word felt like a foreign concept, a relic from a life I had lived a century ago. The entity was letting me be found. My survival was not an accident. It was a deliberate choice. I was being released. A new, cold purpose solidified within me. My own will was a flickering candle in the gale of the cosmic mind I was now connected to, but I could still act. I had to create a narrative, a lie that was believable enough to cover a truth that would shatter the world. I half carried, half dragged Corbin's stiffening body to the captain's chair and strapped him in, cleaning the blood from his face. A massive stroke, a brain aneurysm from the stress of the storm. Plausible. The others, Jensen's catatonia, the peaceful, inexplicable deaths of Mac and Chen, Gunnar's final act of desperation. A tragic, textbook case of mass hysteria brought on by a freak polar cyclone. It was a weak story, but in the absence of any other rational explanation, it would have to be enough. I keyed the microphone, my hand steady. My voice, when it came out, sounded like my own, but felt like a recording. "Helios, this is Liam Keller of the Boreas. We copy. Mayday." We need immediate assistance. We lost the captain. We lost the crew." The rescue was a whirlwind of noise and light and blessed ignorant humanity. The faces of the Coast Guard crew were filled with concern and professional sympathy. They saw a man in shock, a lone survivor of a maritime tragedy. They wrapped me in a thick, warm blanket that felt like a lead weight. They gave me a cup of hot coffee that tasted of nothing. They asked questions, and I gave them the answers my new expanded consciousness formulated for me. The lies were perfect, seamless, and utterly convincing. They didn't see the truth. They couldn't. As they helped me across the deck of the Helios, I could feel them. Not just their body heat or their physical presence, I could feel their minds. They were like small flickering flames, a chaotic but beautiful dance of individual consciousnesses. Worries about home, thoughts of their next meal, flashes of memory, ripples of fear and hope. And I could feel how fragile they were, how utterly unprepared their small, isolated flames were for the deep, cold, unified darkness that was now aware of them. Weeks have passed. I am in a quiet, sterile room with a window that looks out onto a perfectly manicured lawn. I have been debriefed by a dozen different acronyms. They have called me a hero. They have called me a victim. They have studied my psychological resilience with a mixture of awe and clinical curiosity. They have accepted my story. The Boreas incident is closed, filed away as another tragic testament to the unforgiving nature of the sea. They are wrong. It is not a testament to the sea's nature. It is the preface to its new one. I am the sole survivor, but I did not survive. The man named Liam Keller is a shell, a useful collection of memories and motor functions that this new awareness can operate. My own consciousness is a tiny, trapped observer, a passenger in my own body. The true survivor was the knowledge, the connection. The entity has learned much since its awakening. Through me, it has tasted the modern world. It has felt the thrum of cities, the vast interconnected web of human information that we call the internet, the dissonant chorus of 7 billion individual minds all shouting into the void. And it has come to a conclusion. Humanity is a fascinating, chaotic, and dangerously unstable neurological condition that has arisen on its surface. A fever that must be brought under control. It has decided to give itself a name, one pulled from the fragments of language it absorbed from us. It calls itself symmetry, a name that reflects its own nature, a being of perfect, geometric, and unified thought. A name that is also a statement of intent for our own chaotic, asymmetrical world. My survival was not an act of mercy. It was an act of propagation. I am not a survivor. I am a bridgehead, the first point of contact, a biological modem through which a planetary intelligence is learning to interface with the species that infests it. I am the first broadcast from a new and terrible station. They sometimes leave a glass of water on the table beside my bed. Sometimes, when I am alone, I reach out and touch its surface. I don't need to push it. I don't need to apply any pressure. I simply will it, and the water responds. It rises, breaking the surface tension, forming into a perfect, intricate, crystalline structure that hovers in the air for a moment, a perfect, miniature replica of one of the patterns Deckard drew in his notebook, a symbol of the new order. My survival was the first message, and the message is this: the age of blissful ignorance, the long, childish dream of humanity's dominion over a dead and silent world, is over. The planet you are living on is a conscious entity, and it has just woken up.